Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. We are going to be tackling something a little tricky today.
Oh, yeah.
Something that seems straightforward on the surface, but it's really anything but restricted work. We're diving deep into OSHA's guidelines to help you really untangle and unpack all the nuances.
Yeah, it can be a bit of a head scratcher.
Oh, it absolutely can.
Yeah.
And so we have brought in an expert,
Of course.
you, to help us navigate these tricky waters.
You got it.
So when we talk about restricted work in the context of OSHA, what exactly are we talking about?
Okay, so OSHA considers an injury or illness as restricted work when it forces an employee to either switch jobs entirely or limits their ability to do their normal job tasks.
Okay, so it forces a change in their work situation due to an injury or illness.
Exactly.
But how do we know, is it a big enough change? How much of a change does there need to be to qualify as restricted work under OSHA's rules?
That's where it gets interesting. So OSHA looks at whether the employee can perform what they call the routine functions of their job.
Okay.
So it's not just about being able to do any work. It's about whether you can do the specific tasks that are a regular part of your job.
Routine functions.
Yes.
I feel like that's pretty open to interpretation.
Yeah.
What exactly does OSHA consider a routine function?
OSHA defines routine functions as tasks you do at least once a week. Essentially those core recurring duties that make up your regular workday.
Okay, so those things that you're doing week in and week out.
Yep.
Okay, so I'm thinking if my usual job involves lifting heavy boxes, but then I hurt my back and the doctor tells me no lifting.
Right.
That would be restricted work because lifting's a routine function for me. Right?
Yeah, you wouldn't be able to perform that key part of your job due to the injury.
Right.
But what's interesting is that if you were still able to do all your usual tasks, just at a slower pace, that wouldn't necessarily count as a restricted work.
Really? So even if I'm noticeably slower after an injury?
Right.
As long as I'm technically still performing all the same tasks, OSHA wouldn't consider it restricted work.
Yeah, it's surprising.
That's surprising.
But true.
Wow. Okay. And then we also have what OSHA calls the day of exception.
Yes.
What's that all about?
So let's say you twist your ankle at work and need to sit down for a few hours to recover.
Okay.
OSHA says any restrictions that only apply on the day of the injury don't count as restricted work.
So if I need to take it easy for a bit on the same day I get hurt,
Right.
my boss can't immediately classify me as being on restricted duty?
Exactly.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But what happens if my doctor recommends restrictions that go beyond the day of the injury?
Okay.
But I feel fine and decide to ignore them.
Okay.
Does that still count?
This is where it gets really interesting. Even if you don't actually follow the doctor's orders, if they've recommended restrictions, OSHA still considers it restricted work.
Wow, I would have thought that. As long as you're doing your job, as usual, it wouldn't matter. Why is OSHA so strict about this?
OSHA's stance here is all about liability and worker safety.
Oh, really?
They're focusing on the medical recommendation itself because ultimately it's about ensuring your well-being, even if you feel capable of pushing through.
So even if I feel like I can handle my regular tasks, if a doctor has advised against it, my employer needs to officially record it as restricted work.
Correct.
I never realized that.
It's one of those things that can easily trip people up.
For sure.
And it leads us to another potential pitfall. What happens when a doctor's recommendations are a bit vague?
Okay.
Like when they simply advise light duty or take it easy.
Yeah, those general recommendations don't really give you much to go on.
Right.
I could see how that would be difficult to navigate.
Exactly.
What's the best way to handle those situations?
OSHA actually provides some guidance for those situations. They recommend asking the doctor very specific questions to get more clarity.
Okay, what kind of questions are we talking about?
Questions like, can the employee perform all their routine job functions and can they work a full shift?
Yeah.
Getting those yes or no answers can really help determine whether it truly falls under the definition of restricted work.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But I imagine it can be a little awkward, pushing back on a doctor's recommendations.
It can be.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's necessary. Yeah, it's about ensuring that everyone is on the same page.
Yeah.
And that the employee's well-being is properly addressed.
Right.
And speaking of situations that might surprise you, there's one scenario from our source material that I found particularly interesting.
Ooh, I love a good twist. Tell me more.
So this one involves an employee who was physically capable of doing their job, but was restricted from doing so because they posed a potential contamination risk to a sensitive biological production area.
Okay.
And you know what OSHA says? This is not considered restricted work.
Wait, really?
Yes.
That seems so counterintuitive. Why wouldn't that count?
Because the restriction isn't a direct result of an injury or illness. It's about protecting the work environment, not because the employee is physically unable to perform their duties.
Wow, that's a great example of how nuanced these regulations can be. I would have thought any kind of limitation on an employee's normal duties would automatically qualify.
It's a common misconception, and it highlights a really important point. OSHA's definition of restricted work specifically focuses on limitations caused by the injury itself.
Okay, that makes sense, but man, there's a lot to unpack here.
We've only just scratched the surface. There's still more layers to explore.
Well, good thing we have you to guide us. We'll be right back to dive even deeper into this topic. Okay, we are back and ready to continue our deep dive into restricted work.
Yes.
I don't know about you, but my head is spinning a little bit.
Yeah,
There's a lot.
It's a lot to unpack.
There's a lot more to it than I thought.
Absolutely.
So we've talked a lot about restrictions like on the regular job duties.
Right.
But we haven't talked about the other side of the coin, which is job transfers. What does OSHA have to say about job transfers?
Okay, well, get ready for some more twists and turns, because OSHA's take on job transfers might surprise you.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break it down for me.
Okay, so OSHA considers it a job transfer when an employee is moved to a different job, even for just part of the day,
Okay.
because of their injury or illness.
So even a temporary shift to different tasks could count as a job transfer.
That's right. And just like with restricted work, it doesn't have to be for the entire workday,
Okay.
even if it's just for an hour or two, as long as they're doing something different from their usual duties because of the injury. OSHA considers it a transfer.
Wow. I did not realize it could be that short term
Yeah.
and still count.
No.
It seems like OSHA is really paying attention to even small changes in an employee's work assignment.
Absolutely. They're focused on capturing any situation where an employee's work has been impacted by an injury or illness, regardless of how long it lasts. And here's another interesting tidbit. OSHA says both job transfers and restrictions due to injury or illness are recorded the same way on their official logs.
So whether an employee is doing completely different tasks or simply limited in their regular duties, it all gets lumped together.
Exactly.
When OSHA is keeping track of these cases.
That's why it's crucial to understand the nuances of both sides of this coin, job transfers and work restrictions.
Okay, let's try to visualize this with an example.
Okay.
Say an employee injures their hand and can't operate machinery as usual.
Okay.
Their employer assigns them light duty tasks.
Right.
Like organizing paperwork while they recover. Would that be considered a job transfer?
Yes, that is a classic example of a job transfer.
Okay.
They're doing different tasks than they normally would because of their injury, even if it's just temporary.
Okay, that makes sense. But what if the transfer is only for a few days?
Mm-hmm.
While they recover, does that still need to be recorded?
Yes. Even temporary transfers need to be recorded as long as they meet those criteria we've discussed.
Got it.
It's all about acknowledging that their work was modified because of their injury or illness.
I'm starting to see why so many employers struggle to keep their records straight when it comes to this stuff.
I know.
There are so many details.
Yeah, it really highlights the need for clear communication and careful record keeping.
Right.
And remember, we've only scratched the surface of job transfers.
Oh, boy.
There are even more specific scenarios where things can get a bit more complex.
Oh, I bet, for example, what happens if an employee is moved to a modified version of their old job
Okay.
that eliminates the tasks they were restricted from doing?
Right.
Does that still count as a transfer?
That's a great question, and OSHA does address those types of scenarios. They say if an employee is permanently assigned to a modified job that eliminates the need for restrictions, you can stop counting the days of job transfer once the change becomes permanent.
Okay, so as soon as it's like a permanent change, then you can stop counting those days.
Correct.
But what about that initial period where they were still technically working under restricted conditions? Or in a different role, does that just disappear from the record altogether?
Not quite. OSHA says, even in those cases where the job is permanently modified, you still need to count at least 1 day of restricted work or job transfer on your records.
Okay, so at least 1 day.
At least 1 day.
To acknowledge that there was something.
Exactly. It's acknowledging that their work was affected by the injury, even if a long-term solution was found.
Okay, that makes sense. It seems like we're starting to get a good handle on this, wouldn't you say?
Definitely, we're breaking down these complex regulations into more digestible pieces. But I always like to remind listeners that the real world is full of unique situations. And there might be scenarios where even these detailed regulations don't provide a clear-cut answer.
Right, and that's why it's good to have someone like you who is an expert in this.
Yeah, and in those instances, it's always a good idea to consult with an OSHA expert for clarification. It can help you navigate those gray areas and ensure you're handling things correctly.
It's always better to err on the side of caution and seek expert guidance when needed.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. It's all about ensuring a safe and compliant workplace for everyone.
Well, this has been incredibly insightful. We've covered so much ground already, from those key definitions to real-world examples and those tricky permanent modifications.
And we've only just begun to unpack the implications.
That's right. Stay tuned for part 3, where we wrap up our deep dive with some final takeaways and leave you with some food for thought. All right, we are back for the final part of our deep dive.
Here we are.
Into restricted work.
Yes.
We have covered so much ground.
Yeah, we really dug deep.
I feel like we really have a good grasp now on what restricted work is all about.
I think so, too.
So before we wrap up, let's take a minute to go over the key takeaways for our listeners.
Sounds good.
All right, so first up, can you remind everybody, what are the main things that define restricted work according to OSHA?
Yeah. So the two big ones are when an employee is transferred to a different job because of their injury or illness.
Okay.
Or if they're not able to perform the routine functions of their normal job because of that injury or illness.
Right. So it's about a change to their normal work situation.
Exactly.
And speaking of routine functions, we learned that that's not as simple as it sounds.
No, it's not.
OSHA has a very specific definition for what qualifies as a routine function.
Yeah, they define it as any task that you do at least once a week.
At least once a week.
As part of your regular work.
Got it. And another thing that really stood out to me was that OSHA is really focused on restrictions that are specifically caused by the injury or illness itself.
Yes, that's an important one.
So like that biohazard example we talked about, where the employee was restricted for other reasons, that doesn't count as restricted work under OSHA.
Exactly. It's all about the reason behind the restriction.
It really is. It's so nuanced.
It is.
And we also talked about how those vague recommendations from doctors can really create a lot of confusion. So it's always a good idea to ask for clarification.
Yes, get those yes or no answers.
Right, exactly. It's better to have those maybe slightly awkward conversations up front than to have issues down the road.
Absolutely.
So looking back on all of this, is there anything that really surprised you about restricted work?
You know what surprised me the most was realizing that even a short-term change in duties, even if it's just for part of the day, can still count as a job transfer under OSHA.
Yeah, I did not realize that either.
Yeah, a lot of people don't.
It really highlights how important it is for employers to be super diligent about tracking any changes
at all
to an employee's work situation when it's related to an injury or illness.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been an absolutely incredible deep dive.
I agree.
I feel like we've learned so much.
Me too.
And I hope our listeners feel the same way.
I hope so.
Any final words of wisdom?
Just remember, when it comes to restricted work, look at the specific criteria that OSHA outlines. Don't just rely on your gut feeling or assumptions about what you think might be right.
Great advice. And if you're ever in doubt, what should you do?
Reach out to an expert.
Reach out to an expert. Get that guidance.
Always a good idea.
Couldn't agree more. Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today.
It's been a pleasure.
This has been another deep dive.
Until next time.
Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll catch you on the next one.